Brought to you by the Astro Youth House chapter from STEM Arts Lab, Space on Earth is a student-led podcast that inspires listeners who are curious about space to explore the wonders of the universe through the voices of young thinkers, creators, and dreamers.
Each episode blends personal curiosity with scientific discovery, from the mysterious depths of black holes to the practical impacts of space on Earth, like GPS, climate science, and medicine.
Hosted by STEM Arts students from Taos, New Mexico, this podcast draws connections between space, art, and science, how these things all impact us here on Earth, and their meaning to humanity.
You'll hear raw, insightful conversations about topics like light pollution, the overview effect, lunar exploration, and the societal impact of the space race.
Whether you're into exoplanets, dark energy, or just stargazing from your backyard, Space on Earth makes space personal, accessible, and inspiring. We believe that space isn't just for astronauts and scientists, it's for everyone.
Join us on this adventure as we explore the cosmos from Earth, one story at a time.
Special thanks to the Lore Foundation for helping launch this podcast.
Hello, this is episode 16 of Space on Earth. I'm Havilah.
And I'm Pascal.
And this is how New Mexico inspires visions of space. When we think about exploring space, we usually think about rockets, astronauts, telescopes, and distant planets. But long before we could travel somewhere, we first have to imagine it. For generations, New Mexico's enormous skies, colorful deserts, unusual rock formations, and seemingly endless landscapes have inspired artists to look beyond our own world. From paintings and photographies to movies and architecture, science fiction, and more, the landscape of New Mexico can sometimes feel almost extensive itself. Today, on Space on Earth, we're excited to be exploring the relationship between art and space and asking how the landscapes right here in New Mexico have influenced the way people imagine the universe.
So, Havilah, can you start us off with what is it that you think about New Mexico has attracted so many artists from all across the years?
Well, in New Mexico, there are so many dramatic landscapes and enormous open spaces. With its distinctive desert colors and geology and strong contrast between sunlight and shadow, New Mexico has very expansive skies and is relatively isolated in many areas. Because of these things, there has been long artistic traditions among the many cultures of New Mexico, as well as mixing of different artistic traditions between cultures including, but not limiting, to the indigenous cultures, the Spanish, and how more American artists practices. Santa Fe and northern New Mexico became particularly significant centers for American art during the 20th century. But why do you think landscapes like these make people think about space?
Yeah, so I think that for a lot of people who don't live in deserts can feel a little bit alien because there's so much sky and so much land, especially in New Mexico. Usually you can see for like hundreds of miles. I remember if you ever ski and are up at the Santa Fe ski basin on really clear days, you can actually see all the way to the mountains in Colorado. So there's just these gigantic scales where you can see so much. But at the same time, a lot of deserts are actually pretty sparse in what variety of landscapes they offer. Oftentimes deserts, and not specifically northern New Mexico's deserts because we're a high desert, but many deserts have not as many trees. They don't have lots of forests, and they often don't have as many mountains. And so these big landscapes with not always a lot of geological variation can make people feel small. As well, New Mexico has very big, dark skies, which makes the stars so much more prominent on very clear night. You can actually see the entire Milky Way, and it's gorgeous. You can see all of our northern constellations. And so I actually think that's another thing which draws a lot of artists to New Mexico. As well as in our pop culture, desert environments frequently represent other planets, as well as a lot of planets in science fiction can often be based on deserts. Think one of the biggest sci-fi movies in the past couple years was the two Dune movies, and those are set on a desert. The idea of, someone goes, sees Dune, maybe comes to New Mexico, they make that connection, and so that can make them think about space. And even a bit more scientifically speaking, Mars is actually a very rocky planet, and it's a rocky desert, which, if you look at some of northern New Mexico's features, especially up near Taos, is a very clear visual connection. So that's kind of, I think, generally what draws artists. Havilah, do you have any places in New Mexico that have made you think, oh man, that's like, it feels like we're somewhere special or almost like a different planet?
Well, I think New Mexico has some really beautiful views. And what came to my mind was the Gorge Bridge. Sometimes when you're looking out it and the huge rocky cliffs, it can be kind of like reddish. That could remind me a little bit of Mars. Obviously, I've never been to Mars, but I think that could be something that could look similar to some of the things that could be on Mars.
Yeah, and actually, fun little fact, there was actually the Rio Grande Gorge was where they practiced the moon rover. So the rover that they took to the moon in the 70s, I believe, that mission actually trained around the Rio Grande Gorge and that area because it had such similar features to the moon, which is just another kind of really cool idea. So we've been talking about art and we've been talking about New Mexico. And of course, the big name in New Mexico art is Georgia O'Keeffe. Could you talk a little bit about who she was?
Yeah, Georgia O'Keeffe from 1887 to 1986 was her life, and she was a major American modern artist. She began regularly spending time in New Mexico around 1929 and later permanently settled here. She associated with quite a few different things, including the Ghost Ranch and Santa Fe. She painted landscapes, bones, flowers, clouds, and abstract forms. New Mexico's landscape became fundamental to her artist identity. Her preserved home and studio demonstrated how closely her working environment was connected to the landscape she painted. New Mexico really inspired her, and the landscapes around here really helped her form her art and her artist identity.
Yeah, so I think even as an artist myself, I definitely feel that connection. And I always look to artists like Georgia O'Keeffe, who, of course, have made beautiful art. Although I am curious, was Georgia O'Keeffe making space art?
Not really, and that's an important distinction. She didn't claim that she was painting alien planets. The connection is instead about perspective. She took familiar natural objects and presented them in unfamiliar ways. Bones, mountains, enormous skies, and abstract shapes could make familiar landscapes feel strange. Her work demonstrates how an artist can change how people perceive an environment, which is really big in space, too. And isn't that basically something planetary scientists do too? They look at landscapes and try and see them differently.
Yeah, so I definitely think there's a level of looking at it from different perspectives. So, one perspective that a lot of astrophysics, astronomers all look at the space and stars is, of course, from a mathematical perspective, looking for patterns in math, in how things work. And then, even beyond that, just using our eyes to see different shapes. How does gravity warp light? And can we then use math to figure out how it does that. And then colors, even those beyond our visual spectrum. And now with our high technology telescopes, we can observe geological structures on planets and then be able to make inferences about what is going on the planets, especially in our own solar system. So artists observe many of the same things that scientists do, but they really ask very different questions. Scientists ask, what caused this and why does this happen? And all of these more going to the creation of this thing. And art and artists often ask, how does this make me feel, and how can I express that feeling in a visual or audio or performative medium?
Yeah. When NASA released a beautiful picture or does release beautiful pictures of space, is that actually what space would look like to our eyes?
So, this is a very complicated answer because sometimes, yes, sometimes what you can see in a telescope are the same things that the photos that NASA releases are. So you might have a photo of the moon that NASA releases that you could see not as high quality, but still the same colors, the same shapes in a telescope in your own backyard. However, some telescopes also observe wavelengths that humans cannot see, for example, infrared or ultraviolet. And then scientists need to translate that data, which is mainly numbers, into visible colors. Scientists make decisions about what colors to use, what contrast, brightness, and composition to make sure that anybody who's looking at the photo understands what is going on in that photo. So, for example, a very common thing is to make, if you see a photo that has been transferred from, for example, let's say infrared light to our visual light, something that will often happen is they'll assign different colors, for example, blue, red, green, orange, red, to different wavelengths of infrared light so that somebody looking at it can understand that there is a difference between, let's say, the blue that stands for one length of wavelength and the green, which stands for another. So these choices aren't simply decorative, they really do help communicate scientific information. And NASA has collaborated with so many artists and multimedia creators to transform telescope data into immersive visual and audio experiences. And so this kind of brings up a really good question of where does science end and art begin?
Well, there isn't necessarily a clean boundary. Scientific visualization most accurately represents data, but humans still make creative decisions about presenting it. For example, the images from some of the telescopes, including the James Webb, have been artistically colored by scientists and artists. Color can really highlight structures invisible to our eyes, and composition can help people understand complicated information. Art can make scientific discoveries more emotionally understandable, which connecting with science from an artist's perspective is so important.
Yeah, I totally agree. I actually remember, so it was a couple years ago when there was an audio released of what a black hole sounds like, right? And I remember this, I think it was like 5 years ago. And I remember thinking, as someone who wasn't as into space science as I am now, thinking, oh my gosh, that is the coolest thing. My dad brought it up. Me and my family had like a conversation about it. But that's actually not what a black hole sounds like because sound can't travel through space. What it is, it's a scientist taking data and transforming it into audio so that people and the public can have a better understanding of what a black hole sounds like. So I just think that is so cool. And it's also really interesting how much of that flies under the radar. Because I think a lot of people don't quite realize that so much of the images that come from space have had artists working on them and scientists trying to really figure out what is the best way to communicate the data we have to a general audience.
Yeah, that's so amazing. And connecting the science and the art and all of that together is so amazing and artistic. Artists can take science and be so inspired by it to create things that really connect with them or people they love.
Yeah, I love that part about science. I love to incorporate science into my own art, and I love to look for artists who incorporate science into their own art. Just like even I was recently looking at an artist's work, and she had included some representations of sound waves as vibrations. And it was really fascinating because she was able to really use line work to create this feeling of repeating almost pulses of waves. And I just thought that was such a crazy cool thing to be able to take this abstract idea of sound waves and be able to incorporate that into a visual medium. And so this kind of brings up a question for me. Before we had spacecraft photos from, NASA, their telescopes of other planets, how did artists figure out what to draw, what those worlds looked like? How did they figure out what to write about when they wrote their science fiction, all of that?
Well, artists often rely on scientific knowledge available at the time. Telescope observations, even the very basic telescope observations with the very first telescopes, and the Earth's landscape. Also, they would often use their imagination. Space art helped people visualize places humans couldn't visit. And artistic interpretations changed as scientific knowledge improved. So, as we got more information and more images, their interpretations evolved and changed into new things and inspired more art. And now that we've actually photographed places like Mars, how different is reality from what people imagined?
Reality can be very different from what people imagined. So, early Mars artwork often depicted vegetation, canals, or civilizations, very similar to Venus. In the 1930s, Venus was actually thought to be the most Earth like planet, and people imagined that it was a lush jungle. In fact, in a Ray Bradbury story, 100 Summers in a Day, Venus is depicted as this lush jungle. And it's always interesting to look back and be like, oh, that's what people thought at the time. But as our technology has gotten better and we've been able to have more specific data, spacecrafts have revealed that on Mars there are deserts, and on many planets there are volcanoes, canyons so much deeper than any on Earth, as well as ancient river channels. What's actually really interesting is that Mars really it does resemble familiar landscapes on Earth from, once again, our deserts, some of our volcanoes, some of our canyons. And New Mexico is a very easy comparison to make because we have a lot of exposed geology where you can see the rocks, you can see the layers. We have lots of canyons, valleys, and as well as a lot of desert terrain.
Yeah. Why do you think filmmakers use deserts when they want somewhere to look like another planet?
So there are a couple different reasons. One of them is that deserts don't have a lot of visible human markers. So, for example, if you were watching a movie on a different planet and suddenly there was, let's say, a pine tree, it might break your suspension of disbelief, right? You're like, "Oh, I know what that tree is. It's weird that a tree that I know is on a different planet." But deserts don't have this because they already are so empty and often barren that there's less of these markers to break people's suspension of disbelief. There can also be some strange geology, especially if you don't live around deserts, where you look at something and it's crazy that even exists. That's why there are so many national parks in the southwest of America, is because of this geology that has been able to have formed over these years because of the hot, dry climate. And so that's another thing that really draws a lot of filmmakers to using New Mexico and the greater Southwest in film, as well as we also have some other markers, which are we have these huge horizons, which of course are beautiful. And there's also a level of isolation. There's a lot of empty land, especially in New Mexico, but of course, greater Southwest as well. And so there's also more room for filming, which a more everyday problem, but definitely something filmmakers have to consider. And a lot of landscapes, like the ones I've described, can be made extraterrestrial with very little visual altercation. because the less you have going on in the background, the easier it is for VFX artists to add in other elements that appear more alien to our eyes. And so I wonder if, because New Mexico has been portrayed as an alien landscape, or is sometimes perceived maybe as an alien landscape because of some of the movies that have been filmed in deserts that have similar geology to New Mexico. Do you think that changes the way people see the state itself and maybe the people who live in it?
Film and photography definitely influence how places are perceived. New Mexico can become associated with mystery, space, UFOs, science fiction, exploration. Actually, the Wild West has many famous Western movies that were filmed in New Mexico. That can be fun, but it can also simplify a place that has so much deeper culture and so much more history. An important distinction, I think, is that New Mexico isn't an empty alien desert. It is home to living communities and cultures with histories stretching back centuries. That's a particularly useful humanities point because it introduces some cultural thinking and critical thinking instead of simply celebrating the alien desert aesthetic.
Yeah, I definitely think that can happen sometimes where a view of pop culture can really affect a people and an area. Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And so we've talked a little bit about translating scientific data into art, but there are also a lot of artists on space exploration. Could you touch on that a little bit?
Artists contribute through so many different things: mission logs and patches, scientific illustrations, animation, photography, data visualization, museum exhibits, architecture, music, writing, film, graphic design, and even science communications. Scientists can discover something incredible, but someone still has to communicate what that discovery means. And artists really contribute to that. But do you think art can actually influence future scientists and engineers?
Oh, 100%. So people have frequently encountered space through art before studying science. For example, some easy ones are if you've ever read science fiction when you were younger, as well as watched Star Wars when you were younger, or any of the science fiction movies that are coming out, such as I aforementioned, Dune, or even Project Hail Mary. For quite a few young people, this is actually some of their first introduction to space. And I think that can really spark people's curiosity about it. It's actually one of my sparks for my curiosity about space is I'm an avid reader and science fiction is one of my favorite genres. And so I think being able to see all of the possibilities of all of the world that could exist outside of our own, but also are reflections of our own, has always been such a magical thing for me to experience. And it has inspired me to look further into the math and science of space. So, another really cool thing is science fiction has actually imagined technologies before they have become practical. Even words have been used in science fiction before the technology was even there to be used in the real life. Words such as robot, cyberspace, and zero G all were originally used in science fiction before they were used in real world context. Another example of this is artificial intelligence, which is really big these days. That was originally thought of in the mind of a science fiction writer before technology got to the point where that was even a possibility, right? And so inspiration, especially if you're someone who's reading a lot or reading science fiction, can then push people into researching further and developing new technologies that are based in these books that we read, which I think is very telling because it makes those books so much more important to be well thought out and you really have to look at what inspires you and make sure that what inspires you isn't just for your own gain, but also for societal gain. So if you create something, if you're inventing something, it's not just because you read it in a book, but maybe you read it in a book and you think it will make the world a better place and not just, oh, it was cool, I read it in a book. So I definitely think there's a level of consciousness that is often put into science fiction that I hope translates into the people who are inspired to then make stuff and invent things from science fiction, especially through the medium of writing. And so I suppose this also leads back a little bit to, do you think we have to imagine somewhere before we decide that we can go and explore it?
Yes, exploration starts with curiosity, and art lets people mentally visit a place before they can physically be there. Artists can ask questions before technology exists to answer them. Scientific discoveries then reshape what artists imagine. This creates a cycle. Imagination leads to exploration, leads to discovery, leads to new imagination. If humans eventually live on the moon or Mars, do you think we'll start making art?
Oh, definitely. As you've previously mentioned, we have this cycle, and as we explore further into the stars, I'm sure that cycle will continue, and we will just have more things to imagine and more skills to be able to imagine them with. And so, of course, we have science, which gives us the groundwork for reaching further, and art, which allows us to be inspired to really look up into the stars as people have done for hundreds of years. And all of our communities are always both on Earth and maybe ones in the future that will be up in the sky on other planets on the moon. They will, of course, need engineers, but they will also need artists. So, this is the end of our lovely episode of Space on Earth. My name is Pascal, and my co host is.
Havilah, thank you so much for joining us.
And I hope you all have a wonderful day, evening, afternoon, whatever it is. And we'll see you next time. Thank you for listening.